Well, if I'm honest with you, I haven't always had the most robust of prayer lives. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I don't pray. In fact, I do it all the time. I pray for you. I pray for my family and friends. I pray before meals and with my children before they go to bed. I pray in worship and all those times upon which ministers are called to pray. And yet I haven't always been all that satisfied with my prayer life. And apparently I'm not alone. In fact, it might surprise you to discover that according to a recent Pew Research poll, most mainline Protestant ministers are not. 860 of us were interviewed recently, and according to the survey, only 16% were very satisfied with their personal prayer life. 47% were satisfied, 30% were somewhat satisfied, and 7% were very dissatisfied. I don't know the cause for these statistics exactly, but I can speculate. And if I were to guess, I'd say that it has something to do with that question I think deep down haunts anyone who's ever requested anything of God. Or at least it haunts me. Does prayer really work? After all, who hasn't prayed over a child that his pain in venturing out into the world would not be too great only to have him wandering into trouble with cars or drugs or irresponsible relationships? Who has not prayed over that someone to be cured of the cancer that saps her life only to stand in a grave a week later commending her soul to God and her body back to the earth? Who has not pleaded with God for wars to end and conflicts to cease, only to see new wars begin and those same conflicts escalate? I suspect, at least in part, the reason the disciples come to Jesus asking how to pray is for this very reason. In fact, this is the reason a whole host of spiritual advisors are available to give us guidance in our world today. After all, we must be doing something wrong, right? Just type the word prayer into Google search engine and it brings up more than 115,000 book titles. Prayer theory is big business these days. Over 100,000 authors earn royalties by offering to help sort out the mysteries and confusion the Bible's conglomeration of teachings can produce. Although overall, the Bible is pretty clear, at least in one respect, when it comes to prayer. And Jesus says it in our reading this morning. Ask and it will be given you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. In fact, it's reiterated over and over again throughout the Bible. You know these stories. Like in Genesis, when Abraham pleads with God to spare the people of Sodom, not once, but over and over again. And every time, God says, okay. And in Exodus, when the Israelites turn away from God, and God tells Moses that God's wrath is going to burn against the people, but Moses pleads with God to reconsider, and the text reads, the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he'd planned against his people. Then there's the psalmist who writes, those who love me I will deliver, I will protect those who know my name. When they call to me, I will answer them. And James who writes, the prayers of the righteous are powerful and effective. And 1 Peter who says that those of the wicked go unheard. Jesus elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew says, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you will receive it and it will be yours. Given such blanket assurances, it's no surprise later Paul says to his friends, always pray without ceasing. So when my mom found me that day, I was just doing as the Bible had always taught me to. I'd gotten off the school bus at the end of the driveway to our home. I must have been about 6th grade at the time. The driveway stretched a good acre out to the main road, but my mother could always still see me exit the bus every day from the kitchen window. This particular day, she noticed it was taking a bit longer for me to make that walk into the house, and so when she came to the window to look for me a second time, she found me on my knees in the middle of the driveway. Worried I had fallen or was hurt, she started to make her way out to me, but after taking a closer look, noticed I wasn't in any kind of pain, instead, rather quite peaceful. She watched as I returned to my feet and came into the house. As I came inside, she asked me, "What were you doing out there on your knees?" And I said, "Well, I was praying." And she said, "Well, is everything okay? Did something happen at school? Did something happen on the bus? Why were you praying?" "Oh, Mom, don't be silly. I was just praying for our basketball team to win that night." And by the way, we lost that game. Of course, that didn't stop me from treating God like Bruce Almighty in our intro video today. Like some kind of cosmic concierge or super Siri, always ready to do my bidding, whether it was a misplaced file, a crucial ball game, a cancer cure, or climate change. And there's nothing wrong with this kind of prayer. We should keep asking God to intervene, to change hearts and minds, to save us from ourselves. Keep knocking, Jesus says. It might not happen in the way you expect or want, and especially not on your timeline, but God eventually comes to the door with bread. After all, that's what friends do. Keep knocking. But what if the test results come back positive? Or the marriage only gets worse? Or the debt never goes away? Or the child never comes home? What do we do then? Do we lose hope? Do we lose faith? Do we risk prayer again? Friedrich stopped praying altogether, although not immediately. When the phone call came that morning that his granddaughter had been diagnosed with leukemia, at first the prayers came unceasingly. He joined his voice with the millions of parents throughout time who've desperately prayed to God, "Oh Lord, please not my child." But it wasn't long before those prayers proved they could not save her. And Frederick's prayer life became non-existent. A clergy colleague of mine, I remember him asking, "How can this be? Ask and it will be given you. If you only believe, it will be yours." Thousands of prayers have been lifted up on behalf of this child, and we're ministers, for God's sakes. If anyone believes, it's us. He never left the ministry, so I assume he found his prayer life once again. But I suspect not without, like the disciples, having to go to Jesus and ask, "Lord, teach me to pray." Truth be told, I can't help but wonder if at one time or another we've all prayed that prayer. I know I certainly have. It was a particularly difficult time in my life. And not long after praying it, I stumbled across an article I found helpful. The author was writing about the way in which God is largely silent in the book of Lamentations, in the face of laments about Israel's suffering under the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. The writer suggests that God is largely silent because, first and foremost, well, God is a good listener, showing deep respect for Israel's pain. And also that God perhaps uses silence to teach Israel that God wasn't going to immediately resolve their situation. Israel needs some tough skin to live with their enemies. But the most helpful idea to me at the time was that God was demonstrating a baffled silence at the extent of the destruction Israel had experienced. Because sometimes the circumstances are so tragic, no answer is sufficient. And there's nothing anyone, not even God, can say. You see, I don't know how prayer works. I just know it does. Or at least it has for me. In the impossible becoming possible. In things turning out so differently than I'd expected, but for the best for everyone who was involved. And even in the silence of things that have seemingly gone all wrong, and God's best answer to all my prayers was simply God's presence in the pain. So I don't treat God like a vending machine anymore. I certainly ask God for help and strength and even intervene. I ask God for your well-being before surgery, for your family struggles, for the pain you carry with you. I ask God for hearts and minds to be changed, for policies to be enforced for the betterment of all people, for politicians to work together, for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. After all, if any of those things are possible, we certainly are going to need God's help. But prayer for me these days serves a different purpose. Not so much as communication as it is communion. Not so much as transaction as interaction. Not so much asking of God as being with God. During the opening worship service at General Assembly on Saturday night, our denomination's general minister and president, Teresa Hort Owens, preached a sermon on the text in John's Gospel in which Jesus talks about abiding in him. She talked about abiding in Jesus meaning to stay in and with God, to be grounded and rooted first in Jesus because it's in this relationship from which everything else comes, she said. And isn't that ultimately the purpose of prayer? Having a relationship with God. Spending time with the one you love and who loves you. Sometimes you need the Spirit to help you find the words. Sometimes you talk God's ear off at the end of a hard day. Sometimes you laugh with God about the ridiculous thing you said at work. Sometimes you cry because there's nothing else to say. Sometimes you ask because there's nowhere else to turn. But all the time, God is there. Just keep knocking. Keep showing up. Keep trusting. You might ask for pumpernickel at night from a friend and get dry rye in the morning from a stranger. You might ask for toasted wheat in the afternoon and receive old moldy bread broken at a table with an enemy. But regardless, God does answer the door. That's what you do. for people you love.